The Sandy Cemeteries podcast is a MindGuard Media podcast in association with
Screw You, Todd
Productions.
Live in is ever-changing. We can learn a lot from the dead. I'm Sandy Jean, your host, and this is Sandy Cemeteries, Tracing History. We'll learn about some of the oldest towns in the nation, as well as the interesting people who are buried there. Ready? Let's go. In 2009, my husband Dave and I drove to Washington, D.C. for vacation. We had a wonderful time, and driving back, we decided to make a stop in Baltimore, Maryland to visit the Westminster burial ground. The burying ground is the gravesite of many notable individuals, but is most well known as the burial place of Edgar Allan Poe. I just couldn't pass up that opportunity. Westminster Burial Ground, originally Westminster Presbyterian Cemetery, was established in 1786. In 1852, the church was constructed on brick piers above the graves, creating remarkable catacombs. Edgar Allan Poe was originally buried in an unmarked grave towards the back of the cemetery. In 1875, the school children of Baltimore raised money through a Pennies for Poe project, and a monument was dedicated to Poe at the entrance of the cemetery. Poe is buried with his wife, Virginia Clem Poe, and mother-in-law, Maria Poe Clem. The burying ground is also the final resting place for a number of generals and heroes of the American Revolution and War of 1812, including General Sam Smith. Other patriots buried here are John Hollins, Robert Gilmore, John Stricker, Nathaniel Ramsey, James Sterling, John McDonough, and James Buchanan. The burying ground features Maximilian Godefroy's Egyptian Revival gates located at the Green Street side of the cemetery. The gravestones throughout the burying ground include decorated tablets, slabs, and granite vaults. As the resting place of nearly 300 veterans of the American Revolution and War of 1812, many of whom were civic and political leaders, as well as literary legend Edgar Allan Poe, Westminster Burying Ground is a historical and cultural treasure of local, state, and national significance. The church was completed in 1852 and remained in active use until 1977. In 1974, Westminster was placed on the National Register of Historic Sites. In 1977, Westminster Preservation Trust, Inc. was established under the leadership of University of Maryland's Francis King Carey School of Law. The trust completed a renovation of Westminster Hall in 1983 to preserve and restore the historic features and adapt the church for contemporary use. Westminster Hall is now used for weddings, receptions, lectures, conferences, and other events. Now, let's take a look at the life of author and poet Edgar Allan Poe. Poe is most remembered for his influence on other writers and poets throughout his imaginative use of literary style and for his near-flawless use of rhythm and sound in his poetry. He is considered the father of the modern detective story and the psychological thriller. Born in Boston, Poe was the son of touring actors David Poe Jr. and Elizabeth Arnold Poe. When he was 3 years old, his parents died, and he was taken into the home of John Allen, a wealthy merchant in Richmond, Virginia, who renamed him Edgar Allan Poe. In 1826, he entered the University of Virginia, staying only 1 year and running up large gambling debts that John Allen refused to pay. Allen pulled him from college and broke up his engagement to Elmira Royster. Lacking means of support, Poe enlisted in the Army, but had his first book, Tamerlane and Other Poems, published at his expense and was able to pay off his debts. Reconciled with Allen, his adopted father paid for his release from the Army and secured an appointment to West Point for Poe. But he dropped out after 6 months. His fellow cadets paid for a publishing of his book, Poems, in 1831, which contained his famous poem, To Helen. Taking up residence with his aunt, Maria Clem, in Baltimore, he supported himself with writing stories, which he sold to the Philadelphia Saturday Courier and other newspapers. In 1835, Poe married his cousin, Virginia Clem, who was 13 years old, and they moved to Richmond, where he became the editor of the Southern Literary Messenger. He was highly praised for his reviews of contemporary writers, but this also brought him criticism from those offended, who complained to the magazine's owners. In January 1837, the owners fired him as an editor, but continued to publish his poems and stories. He moved to New York City, then to Philadelphia, and back to New York, each time looking to establish himself in the literary world, but with only moderate success. In January 1847, Virginia died, and he became a heavy drinker. In 1849, he revisited Richmond and was able to become engaged to his first love, Elmira Royster. Returning to Baltimore, he was found unconscious on a Baltimore street and died, quote, of congestion of the brain, unquote, according to the local newspapers. Popular lore states that he died of alcoholism. However, some claim that he died from exposure or from encephalitis. Well, that's Edgar Allan Poe's life, but what about the hauntings at Westminster Burial Ground? The following information was taken from the website morbidlybeautiful.com. Edgar Allan Poe's death itself is veiled in mystery, so much so that he was originally buried in an unmarked grave towards the back of Westminster Burying Grounds. After the school children raised money through that project called Pennies for Poe in 1875, a monument dedicated to the author was erected at the entrance of the cemetery. As a result, Poe's body was moved and buried with his wife, Virginia Clem Poe, and next to his mother-in-law, Maria Poe Clem. The dedication was attended by American poet Walt Whitman, and many believe that Poe's spirit is not at rest, and they have reported seeing his ghost walking around his gravesite and even standing at the altar inside Westminster Hall. But Poe is not the only specter haunting the infamous graveyard. The decapitated head of an unknown murdered minister has been seen on the grounds. Reports claim that the skull would scream at all hours of the day and night. These screams were said to be so terrible they would linger in the minds of those who spent prolonged time around it until it drove them to the point of insanity, forcing them to take up residence in psychiatric wards. Another famous ghost frequently spotted on the grounds is that of Lucia Watson Taylor, who passed away in 1816 at the age of 16. Her spirit often appears as a misty figure dressed in white, kneeling in prayer by her own grave. But the catacombs of the Westminster Burial Ground are said to be the most haunted place in all of the cemetery grounds. While many robberies consisted of jewelry and artifacts found on the dead, some of the catacombs were robbed of the bodies within them as well. During the mid-19th century, Davidge Hall, also known as the College of Medicine of Maryland, was located near the cemetery. These grave robberies occurred during the era when medical students began dissecting corpses, and cemeteries were often robbed of freshly dead bodies in order to advance medical science. It is rumored that during this time, 2 medical students of Davidge Hall were caught in the act of removing bodies to take back to the dissecting lab. When they were caught, a commotion was raised to the point that it created a mob, and one of the students was hanged from a nearby streetlight. His ghost is said to now wander through the grounds as well. There are also legends that persist that some spirits wander the cemetery seeking out revenge on those who accidentally buried them prematurely. This took place during an era where comas were mistaken as death, and people who suffered from being comatose were commonly presumed dead and then were buried accidentally. The church again remained active until 1977. However, after World War I, the neighborhood changed, and the Presbyterians who originally worshipped there chose to move their services elsewhere. At this point in time, local children began using the graveyard as a playground. One minister reported seeing the children running around with the unearthed skulls on the ends of broomsticks, thus stirring up more ghostly activity at Westminster. Visitors of the cemetery and burial grounds report bodiless voices, sounds of footsteps walking towards them, and horrific screams. Some claim the grip of icy hands on their shoulder, unexplainable foul stenches, and the encounter of cold spots throughout the grounds. The sightings of Edgar Allan Poe around the burial grounds are a common occurrence, and some claim he has even spoken to them. He's been spotted wearing a long black coat, a wide-brimmed black fedora, and a scarf covering his face. He stands solemnly in front of his grave as if he longs for another shot at life. Mysteriously, the same type of figure was seen yearly on the anniversary of his death, from 1920 to 2009. Standing before Poe's grave, leaving red roses and a bottle of Poe's favorite drink, cognac. Now, no one has ever confirmed if it is an apparition of Poe or one of his living fans. Like most hauntings, there are, of course, many takes on each story. Everything in life is a matter of perception, they say. Alas, Dave and I didn't witness anything ghostly or unusual during our visit to Westminster Burial Ground. However, we did get to enjoy the beauty, the history, and the uniqueness of this very, very old resting place. If you're ever in Baltimore, pay the Westminster Burial Ground a visit. Check out our other podcasts, the Sandy and Toddcast and the Empathicary podcast, on any of the platforms that you normally find your podcasts, including YouTube and Twitter. Be sure to like the Sandy and Toddcast on Facebook to keep up on the latest goings-on, including each week's new episode. You can also join our group Stay Weirdos Friends of the Sandy and Toddcast for more fun. We're like a big family there. It's a safe place to share your thoughts, feelings, ideas, and random inappropriate memes without judgment.